Polls in the 2024 election essentially have a dead heat between former President Donald Trump and current President Joe Biden, with the RCP average having Donald Trump up by just 0.2%. So, of course, in today's video, we're going to look at the 2024 presidential election, fill out this entire map at time, and ultimately predict at this point in time who is the likely favorite for the presidency in November. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So I should preface this by saying that at the current moment, President Biden's job approval rating is about 15 points underwater. So the vast majority of Americans, over 55%, disapprove of the job President Biden is doing, and only 40% approve of that job, or 41%. At this point in time, for previous presidents in their term, April 11th of their fourth year, Donald Trump was at a 45% approval rating, Barack Obama was at 48%, and George Bush was at around 48% as well. Obama and Bush would end up going on to re-election. Donald Trump at around 45% would go on to lose in 2020. And at this point in time, if job approval ratings are any indicator of a incumbent president's prospects for re-election, then Joe Biden should go on to lose in 2024. But of course, as we go into the electoral map, the answer is certainly a lot more complicated as to whether or not who's likely to win in November. So of course, without further ado, we'll start categorizing all of these states and congressional districts on the map. We'll start off with Nevada, as we always do, and work our way towards the east. Now, if we take a look at current polling in the state of Nevada, currently Donald Trump is up by a considerable amount, and he's led consistently in every poll conducted in the state since October of last year. So of course, if that was any indication of the actual result, Donald Trump should win Nevada by several points. Now, Nevada is a state that overestimates Republican support. It always has, more often than not, over the past 10 years or so. When we take a look at the various ratings for the state of Nevada, you have anywhere from tilt Democrat to lean Republican, most of these offering a toss-up. Now, if you want my honest opinion, I think Nevada certainly is a toss-up, but obviously we're going to try and categorize the state one way or the other. You know, taking a look at previous election results, you know, Nevada in 2020 voted to the right of the nation, you know, as did Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona. You know, it was the only state that Hillary Clinton had won in 2016 that actually voted to the right of the nation in 2020. Minnesota, Virginia, Colorado all voted to the left, and in Colorado's case, very significantly voted to the left of the nation. So, you know, Nevada at this point in time, and I've said in previous videos where I've predicted the outcome, I said would always go possibly narrowly to Joe Biden. Certainly depends on the issues that the candidates focus on. But, you know, as of right now, with the trends that we're seeing in Las Vegas, you know, Clark County, with a continued shift towards the right. And even in 2022, you saw a split verdict in the state of Nevada. And you also saw that in the state of Wisconsin, which we'll get to in a little bit. But in the state of Nevada, you had Catherine Cortez Masto, the incumbent, who really wasn't unpopular to any degree, almost get dragged down by the sort of red puddle, I guess you could say, that occurred around the country. You know, Republicans did win the popular vote by several points, but they ended up losing most of the key races. Catherine Cortez Masto only won her election by around a point, a little less than that. So if that's any indication as to where the Democrats are in Nevada, and given the fact that, you know, Joe Biden is so unpopular in the state, you could see depressed turnout from critical groups like minorities and white progressives, which could potentially swing the state in the direction of Donald Trump. I mean, again, back in 2020, only a 2.4% margin of victory, and Nevada voted to the right of the nation in 2020, as it did in 2016 as well. So for the first time, I actually think that Donald Trump has a narrow shot at actually flipping the state of Nevada. This is the first time in either ever or a long time that I've had the state of Nevada actually going red in 2024. But at this point in time, I actually think if Donald Trump's polling lead in the state holds up, he actually will be able to flip the state of Nevada very, very narrowly. And again, this is because of the trends we've seen in Clark County. You know, over 60% of the state's population lives here. It's continually moved towards the right. You've had a lot of Californians who are more conservative. These are conservative Californians by and large, moving to places like Las Vegas, changing the state, as you have also seen the GOP make important inroads with Latinos. So because of that, I actually think 2024 could potentially be the year. Now, a few weeks ago, I was saying the opposite, but, you know, at this point in time, I think Nevada is certainly flippable. You know, Joe Biden is 15 points underwater. He's very unpopular in the state of Nevada. You've had a huge divide in the Democratic base over the Israel-Palestine issue, and I think If that holds until November and these, non-committed voters are actually going to stick to their guns in that sense, I actually think that that depressed turnout among liberal voters could swing the state. Moving on down to Arizona. Now, this is going to be interesting because normally Arizona votes to the right in Nevada. We saw that in the 2020 election. Joe Biden won the state by 0.3%. Very, very narrow margin, but was the first Democrat to win here since 1996 in a presidential election. Go back to 2016. Arizona's voting red by around 3.5 points. Fast forward to today in 2024, if we take a look at the polls out of Arizona. Now, this is interesting because this is one of the areas where I think I'm going to disagree with the polls pretty considerably. Donald Trump is leading in the state of Nevada in every single poll going back to August, so almost a year ago, August 2023. Donald Trump is leading in every single poll. Arizona's been ranked as a toss-up. Now, contrary to what I said about Nevada, I actually think this doesn't bode too strongly for Donald Trump because Arizona is a very different state than Nevada. While Nevada's actually been trending slightly towards the right over the past few years, Arizona, especially in the era of Trump, has been trending more towards the left. And I actually think that Joe Biden might actually do better in the state of Arizona than he did in 2020. Now, I think it's going to be relatively close. Again, you will see a lot of Latino voters in Arizona potentially swing in Trump's direction, but you do have suburbs around Maricopa County, these other counties that are trending blue. I don't think that's really going to stop. You also have the issue of abortion front and center in the state of Arizona. You don't have that in the state of Nevada. In fact, I believe Joe Lombardo, the Republican governor of Nevada, actually agreed to some sort of Democrat compromise bill to basically enshrine abortion rights in the state. Don't quote me on that, though, but I think there was something about that in the news many months ago that kind of drew the ire of some Republicans who were mad at him for signing it. Abortion is going to be on the ballot in Arizona in 2024, and I think because of that, Joe Biden actually has the edge. Now, again, Joe Biden's very unpopular here in Arizona, but I actually think he's more unpopular, according to polls, in Nevada than he is in Arizona. These are very different states at this point. Nevada trending right, Arizona trending left, but of course abortion's not really an issue in Nevada, and I think Joe Biden and the Democrats are going to make abortion a huge issue in 2024. Moving over to New Mexico, I think despite the fact that Joe Biden is very unpopular in the state, polling has had him up in New Mexico by around 8 points. I think he probably wins the state by a similar margin. I could see Donald Trump doing slightly better in some of the rural exurban counties. I don't think he's going to do particularly much better in places like Albuquerque, maybe by like a point or so, but I don't think New Mexico is going to be very competitive on that front. It's a very stagnant state, unlike Arizona and Nevada, which has seen large amounts of population growth over the years. New Mexico has really not seen that whatsoever. You don't have the same job opportunities, growing cities that you do in these other Sunbelt states, and as a result, its politics has really stayed very stagnant since 2008 as sort of this likely to safe blue state overall. Moving over to Texas, this is another state where Donald Trump is polling a lot better than I think he's actually going to do. If we go to Texas, as we looked in yesterday's video, Donald Trump is up in the aggregate by around 9 points. Now, overall, I think Trump could potentially do better in Texas than his 2020 performance. I still think Texas is going to be relatively close just because of the fact that you have massive demographic change in Texas, massive urbanization, all things that really tend to benefit Democrats. And the only thing that I think might bail out Donald Trump here is the fact that Joe Biden is very unpopular, super unpopular in Texas. He's 20 points underwater. And while this state should, in theory, be a blue state based on its demography, Republicans have somehow been able to reverse some of the trends and actually swing the Rio Grande Valley area towards Donald Trump. So if this area comes out big for Donald Trump, you see a bigger swing there, and maybe Democrats don't gain as much in Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston as we expect them to. Maybe they slide a little bit, especially in Houston. I could see maybe even getting a point or two redder. You could potentially see maybe a 6 to 7 point margin of victory in Texas. So based on the polling now, that's the way I'm probably going to rank it, around 6 to 7 points. And that's a little bit different than yesterday's video, but you have to consider I'm also taking polls into account in this prediction. So that would have Donald Trump doing slightly better than his 2020 performance. Puts him in a safer range, obviously, and of course that could probably help Ted Cruz, because if Donald Trump is winning by 7, Ted Cruz is not losing. He probably ends up winning by maybe 5 or 6. I mean, it's a real debate as to whether or not Donald Trump or Ted Cruz is going to run better in the state of Texas. But nonetheless, I think Donald Trump might marginally improve in Texas if current trends hold. Again, I think he'll do slightly worse in the Austin area, which has seen massive growth, especially from liberal San Franciscans. There's other liberal groups from all over the country. But overall, I think you could potentially see a slight shift to the right. The reason I bring that up is because the population of Texas is not the same as it was in 2020. It's 2024. You've had 4 years of potentially more Californians moving to Texas. And while some of them have been liberal, you also have a number of conservatives moving to, say, the Houston area or maybe Dallas, Fort Worth. Because again, in 2022, and I know Trump wasn't on the ballot in 2022, but if you look at the state of Texas, Republicans improved basically everywhere across the state, the only exception being Travis County, where Beto O'Rourke was very popular. But if you look at Dallas, for instance, Greg Abbott got 36% of the vote. Other down ballot Republicans got similar margins. So, this is a state where Republicans can somewhat take back the suburbs, but I think it's really up in the air as to whether or not Donald Trump's going to be able to do that in 2024. Moving on up to Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, I actually think this is going to remain probably likely Biden. I really don't think you're going to see a significant shift towards the right here, mainly because this district is very suburban. Joe Biden won the old district by around 7 points. The new district really isn't that much redder, and as a result, I think you're probably going to see Biden carry that district. Now, it's interesting because Nebraska is in the process of potentially removing, separating its electoral votes by congressional district. So if that ends up being the law of the land, then Nebraska's 2nd congressional district won't matter anymore. The whole state of Nevada will vote for Donald Trump. Moving up to Minnesota. Now, Minnesota, I've said, is sort of a lost cause for Republicans in the past, and I certainly think in the near future, Republicans are going to have a very, very difficult time winning this state because you've had massive growth in demographic change in Minneapolis. You've seen the bluing there. You have a lot of Somali immigrants in that area that are voting heavily Democratic. But because of the whole Israel-Palestine thing, and, Minnesota tends to have a little bit of a progressive tinge to it, I think you may see potentially a dampening in Democratic enthusiasm, specifically in those Somali Muslim communities over Joe Biden's handling of Israel-Palestine. And while I don't think that's going to be enough to win the state by any means, you could see this previously 7-point margin in 2020 narrowed down to maybe about 5 points, which I think sounds about right. You might see rural Minnesota continually get a little bit redder. Minneapolis might get a little stagnant. I don't think it's going to get that much bluer in 2024. I think, again, because of the enthusiasm gap, Republicans are probably going to be slightly more energized to vote in 2024. I could actually see Republicans making some gains in Minnesota, but not enough to flip the state. So I think Minnesota probably goes to Joe Biden by around 5 points. Wisconsin, I think, is going to be tough to categorize because, this was an incredibly close state in 2016 and in 2020. 2016, Donald Trump wins the state of Wisconsin by 0.7. Biden wins the state of Wisconsin by around 0.6 in 2020. And fast forward to 2024, Wisconsin is completely up for grabs. Now, if we take a look at polls in the state of Wisconsin, it's basically 50-50. You've got some polls where Donald Trump is ahead, some polls where Joe Biden's ahead. If we take a look at the polls conducted in the year 2024, Joe Biden only leads in one of them. And, this is a state that has historically overestimated Democratic support when it's come to presidential elections. But, polling has been a bit different lately because when pollsters tried to fix their methodology after the 2016 and 2020 election results, they actually overcounted and overestimated Republican support, which is probably why the 2022 midterms were so off in terms of the polling error that we saw. And, this state's going to be really the state that decides the presidency. I don't think it's going to be Pennsylvania. I think Pennsylvania, honestly, not to spoil the rest of the video, but probably leans a bit more in the Democratic column. And I actually think Democrats are probably going to improve potentially in Pennsylvania for a number of reasons we'll talk about probably in a separate video. But it's just a very difficult state for Republicans to win. Wisconsin, on the other hand, is a bit different because in 2022, we saw a pretty massive blue wave in Pennsylvania. In Wisconsin, that was not the case. Now, the governorship ended up staying in Democratic hands. Tony Evers ended up winning by nearly 4 points over his opponent, Tim Michels, who was pretty lackluster candidate. But again, you can't really make excuses for the GOP here. This was a very winnable race, and they failed to win it. But the Senate race in Wisconsin, which, Ron Johnson was projected to win by 5 points, he barely held on to his seat here, winning by just 1. But however, he still won. Wisconsin voters split their tickets, voting for both Ron Johnson, one of the most conservative Republican senators, and also Tony Evers, who is a pretty progressive, liberal Democratic governor. So you do have, for whatever reason, some crossover where you've had people voting for Ron Johnson and, of course, Tony Evers. Now, in 2024, it really depends on the issues that are focused on. Obviously, Joe Biden is not popular in Wisconsin. He's 15 points underwater nationally, but in Wisconsin, his approval isn't actually as underwater. Now, I really think the ultimate what if is what the turnout looks like in Milwaukee. If black turnout is down in Milwaukee and all else is equal, this state probably narrowly flips red. Now, you also have to account for the fact that the WOW counties have been getting bluer, these suburban collar counties outside of Milwaukee. And we saw that with the judicial elections in 2023, where the Republicans lost control of the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. So because of that, and because of how weak Republicans have been performing in the state overall, I narrowly give the edge in Wisconsin to Joe Biden. I think the Rust Belt is going to be the real challenge for Donald Trump, not so much the Sun Belt. Arizona being the exception, but I think where you have Nevada, Texas, Georgia concerned, I think Trump's looking to be in a lot better of a position in 2024 than he was in 2020. But I think the Rust Belt, holding on to the Rust Belt, or winning back the Rust Belt, I should say, from Donald Trump's point of view, I think that's really going to be the challenge. Moving on to Michigan, again, you still have similar factors that we talked about in Minnesota. There's a significant Muslim population outside of Detroit, as there is in Minnesota's Minneapolis. I still think at the end of the day, Michigan leans in the Democratic column. I mean, if we take a look at the polls, you do have Donald Trump ahead somewhat narrowly. But if you look at the polls in Michigan, Donald Trump is ahead narrowly. I don't really expect that to hold come Election Day. Again, Michigan was bluer in the 2020 election, then Wisconsin, then Pennsylvania. Now, that order doesn't always have to be permanent, but I think this state is fundamentally more Democratic than Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And I think if Joe Biden's winning Wisconsin, he's probably going to win Michigan as well. So I think probably we might even downgrade this a little bit. A very narrow victory for Joe Biden, less than 2 points in both of these states. Moving on up to Maine, 2nd Congressional District, probably going to Trump. State at large, probably going to Joe Biden. Probably by 12 points. It could even be a safe margin. New England is not an area that is really Republican friendly. It hasn't been throughout the 21st century. And I think you could potentially see Joe Biden even improve in states like Maine, even though around most of the country, he's going to do significantly worse. Moving on down to New Hampshire, another New England state that I think is basically going to be out of reach for Donald Trump. I think Joe Biden is up nearly double digits in the state of New Hampshire. And when we've looked at previous election results, 2022, Don Bolduc losing by nearly 10 points, so on and so forth. Donald Trump, of course, losing the state by 7. I'm not surprised. New Hampshire has been trending in the blue direction. I think Democrats hold on to it. Now, Pennsylvania could be interesting because out of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, this could potentially be the bluest state out of the Rust Belt states, which sounds very crazy, but I want to make a whole video talking about Pennsylvania itself and the politics going on there, because I think Republicans are really in quite a conundrum because they've really maxed out the rural areas in the state. We saw that at play in 2020, Donald Trump improving in a fair amount of rural counties in the western part of the state. And while he did lose ground in northeastern Pennsylvania, the Republicans haven't gained this ground back since. You did have some down ballot races in 2021 for the state Superior Court, or their equivalent of the Supreme Court, where the Republican won very narrowly. But that was sort of when Republicans were on the up and up. You didn't have the repeal of Roe v. Wade. Joe Biden was still unpopular, and you still had COVID restrictions very present in the mind of a lot of conservative voters, which energized their turnout. But, it looks like as of right now, the Pennsylvania rurals are essentially maxed out. Now, 2024 could prove my point incorrect if Donald Trump does win the state. He's obviously going to need to have a very high rural turnout and very good margins in rural counties. But the Pennsylvania Democratic Party has a very powerful operation. The rapid swing to the left of the Philadelphia collar counties is basically keeping the state of Pennsylvania as a whole from flipping red. Had the margins in the collar counties been around the same as they were in 2012, Pennsylvania would probably be leaning Republican at this point in time and would have gone Republican in the 2020 election more likely than not. So, in 2024, especially when compared to the midterms, you had, John Fetterman win by almost 5 points against Dr. Oz. Abortion was a huge issue in Pennsylvania, still is a huge issue, especially in these collar counties in Allegheny County. I actually think you could see Joe Biden do slightly better in Pennsylvania, maybe winning the state by 2 or 3 percentage points. And again, I want to make a whole video talking about Pennsylvania and why I think the Republicans are in a worse position there than they are in Michigan and Wisconsin. Moving on down to the state of Virginia. Now, normally I categorize the state of Virginia as a safe blue state right off the bat, and I'm not saying that it's not going to be a safe blue state, but I do want to talk about Virginia because in 2020, you saw Joe Biden win the state of Virginia by 10 points. Some people had theorized that this was the Democratic max in the state, that the Nova counties really couldn't get that much bluer in a presidential election. And, certainly I think that Virginia is going to be comfortably in the Joe Biden category, but something we need to talk about with Joe Biden's falling approval ratings is the depression in black turnout in places like Richmond and Hampton Roads. Now, that's not going to be enough to swing the state in Donald Trump's direction, not even close, but could it make Virginia potentially closer than it was in 2020? Perhaps. I still think it's going to be around the same. I think it'll be around 10, 11 points or so. You could even see a 12-point margin, but I think you are probably going to see a depressed turnout among black voters, and you might see maybe a depressed turnout in some of the more liberal Nova suburbs, although I think that you'll probably see about the same as we did in 2020, since these voters are very hyper-political, hyperactive, and will do anything to vote against Donald Trump. So, I still think Virginia probably stays in the likely Democratic category, which for me is anywhere from 6 to 12 points. I think you're going to be on the higher end of that, but it's not impossible that Joe Biden does worse in Virginia than he did in 2020, because unlike Colorado, Virginia has not zoomed left off a cliff, and Republicans have actually taken back the state in 2021 to a certain degree. They didn't take all chambers of government, but you still have Governor Youngkin in charge of the state overall. Moving on down to North Carolina, I think Donald Trump at this point in time is in a much better position in North Carolina than he was in 2020. Back in 2020, Donald Trump only won North Carolina by a little over a point because he lost a lot of ground in the Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro, these urban, suburban counties where you've seen significant growth, the research triangle of North Carolina among educated white-collar professionals. And, this is a demographic that the Republicans have been struggling to win lately. Mitt Romney had a much easier time winning these voters than somebody like Donald Trump will have. I think similar to Virginia, you're going to see a depressed turnout among potentially progressive Democrats and black voters in urban areas in the state. And that's probably why, if you look at polls in North Carolina for 2024, Donald Trump is up very considerably in a lot of polls. And I think probably you're going to see North Carolina end up going to Donald Trump at this point in time by a lean margin. Now, in previous videos months ago, I'd actually had North Carolina going to Joe Biden very narrowly because of the trends we've seen in urban areas. But again, the reason I do these predictions so often is because they change. They change with new data. And I think as of right now, Donald Trump is in a much stronger position in North Carolina than he was a few months ago. So I think the state probably goes about 2 to 3 points in his direction. Moving on down to Georgia, this is another state where, mass demographic change, as with all the Sun Belt, has really changed this state's politics. As recently as 2016, Georgia wasn't really a heavily contested state by the Democratic Party. Donald Trump won the state by around 5 points. And, at the end of the 2016 election, nobody really thought that Georgia would be that competitive, especially if Donald Trump was to go on, obviously, to win re-election. But if we go to 2020, Georgia flipped blue for the first time since 1992, but this was the closest state in the entire country. Joe Biden won by just 0.2%, and a lot of this was due to high turnout in the Atlanta metro area, high black turnout, which ultimately delivered Joe Biden the state of Georgia. Now, fast forward to 2024, enthusiasm for Joe Biden among Democratic voters is at an all-time low, and it shows in the polls. Joe Biden has not led in the state of Georgia since May of 2023. And even though Republicans, keep in mind, this was a state where Herschel Walker lost by 3 points in 2022. But, the caveat is Brian Kemp and the rest of the Republicans did fairly well in Georgia. So it could just be down to the fact that, Herschel Walker was a very bad candidate. 2020 was sort of a perfect storm against Republicans in the state. Georgia is undoubtedly becoming a much bluer state, and the post-Trump era, especially 2020 and obviously past that, because you saw, of course, the special elections in 2021 go to Democrats. But a massive demographic shift has taken place in Georgia over the past 20 years. You've seen an influx, as Wikipedia points out, of African Americans, Asians, Latinos, and white progressives, especially in the Atlanta area, which has really made the state extremely competitive. But, the polls right now have Donald Trump winning the state by 6-7 percentage points. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think he's going to win the state by that much, but at this current time, could he win the state by around 2 or 3? I think so, which for the first time in a while, I'm putting Georgia in the lean Republican category. Now, I think it's on the lower end of that, maybe 2 or 3 points, but the data certainly indicates that, depressed turnout among Democrats is a very big issue for them in Georgia, North Carolina, even Nevada. And I think you could potentially see Trump benefit from that. So that puts Trump at 227, Biden at 281. So with this map, Joe Biden still wins, but Donald Trump is gaining as compared to my previous predictions. I should change the fact that I think Ohio is probably going to be likely red, not safe red. I think you could see probably a 10-point margin for Donald Trump. It's a state that has been trending towards the right, but I still think you have enough urban areas in Ohio to keep the state from being a 12-point margin or more for Republicans. Finally, we move down to the state of Florida. I don't really think this is going to be an issue for Republicans. I think Donald Trump probably wins Florida at this rate by around 6 or 7 points. Democrats are apparently disregarding Florida in 2024, which is something they should have done probably after 2020. We're going to talk about the Democratic target states in a future video next week, because I think it is very telling about where the Democrats see this race versus where the Republicans are seeing 2024. But I think because of Democrats sort of pulling out of Florida, Republicans are going to continue to see pretty large gains there, as they have been. Republicans now make up the largest share of voters in Florida, and they've consistently won statewide and federal races here since 2016. So I think this era is likely to continue in 2024, and Trump's probably going to win there more comfortably than he did last time. Anyway, that's it for today's video. 281 to 257 for Joe Biden. So you really only need to flip 1 or 2 states for this result to change. And, Wisconsin and Michigan being so close in this prediction, easily one of those states could flip and potentially deliver the presidency to Donald Trump. So very close, but overall, this is probably how the election would go as of April 2024. And we'll keep making these presidential predictions probably about once a month until we get to Election Day. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching.